light of Celestia's dawn broke through Fluttershy's window to play along the floorboards and glaring pictures in her room. The reflection caught Fluttershy's sleeping face, and she flinched from the intrusion. Groggily, she blinked away the drowsiness of the early morning. She was used to waking up with the roosters, as Applejack said, and was often up and about hours before the rest of Ponyville. This morning, though, was different. Instead of getting out of bed, looking ahead to a day of tending to her animals, catching up with her friends, and the general easy-going life she had loved about a small place like Ponyville. Yesterday had changed all of that, though. Now she was fighting for her life, and worse, she had to do it alone. 5 minutes ticked by as Fluttershy languished in the paradoxically cheery dawn as she tried to work up the energy to get out of bed. She knew that it would get easier once she started, but the initial impetus was eluding her. She couldn't lay in bed forever, either. She didn't know if Master was much of a morning pony, but she got the impression he probably was. A scowl inched his way across Fluttershy's face as she rolled onto her back and glared up at her ceiling. Master? I just called him Master in my own head. I can't even get away from him in my mind. What is he doing to me? It was the guise. It had to be. Sombra had told her they hadn't done anything to her mind beyond the initial spell, but she didn't know if she believed him. He had been nothing but brutally honest with her since the beginning, so even knowing who and what he was, Fluttershy found it hard to distrust him. That, and he had no reason to lie to her. She couldn't defy him. Fluttershy told herself that over and over, but in the end she kept on coming back to the same argument. Why can't I defy him? Fluttershy fought away another wave of tears as she kicked her covers off and rolled out of bed and onto her hoofs. Even when I'm allowed to, it's like I don't want to. Is it really just me? It felt like her mind was filling with a buzzing white noise as Fluttershy stepped out into her living room and made her way to the kitchen. The air was chilly and summer was fading. Soon the leaves would begin turning and the running of the leaves would be held, and soon after that she would have to say goodbye to her hibernating animal friends until next year. If I'm even still here next year, Fluttershy muttered softly as she began boiling water for the morning tea. I wonder if I'll even make it to the end of fall. I should think so. A deep voice answered Fluttershy's self-directed question, startling the butter-yellow Pegasus from her grim imaginings. Glancing over at the hallway, she saw Sombra standing in the threshold of the hall, watching her. He looked good. Better than yesterday, at least. He stood a little straighter. She hadn't noticed it before, but he had almost seemed to sag with the weight of his own body yesterday. Now he was much healthier looking. Forgive me, Your Majesty. Fluttershy turned and curtsied, bowing her head as she did. I did not hear you wake up, or I would have hastened to make up some breakfast. Sombra seemed to consider this for a moment before he shook his head. No, I think not. He cut through Fluttershy's instinctive protest like a fine blade as he continued past her to the living room window and peered outside. I can safely assume they serve breakfast foods in the village proper, yes? Fluttershy nodded silently as the teapot began to whistle. Moving mostly by instinct, she began the process of adding her own personal blend. Fresh black Minnesotarian leaves alongside a pinch of fresh peach and a peeling of an apple from Sweet Apple Acres. Good. You spoke of acquiring a bed frame for my chambers. I have decided to accompany you on your errands. Sombra gave a faint sniff as he spoke before giving Fluttershy a approving nod. Most fragrant mixture, Mouse. I approve. Thank you, Your Majesty. Fluttershy was still processing his declaration. She couldn't rightly tell him no, literally in fact, but... Shaking her head, Fluttershy checked the tea with a sniff and nodded. It was done. If the fragrance was too thin, the steeping would not be complete, but too overpowering and the flavors would be overpowered, the sweetness of the apple and the peach clashing with the bitter sharpness of the leaves. She had perfected this mixture some time ago, though, and it irked her that she hoped Sombra liked it. May I ask why Your Majesty intends to move about the village? Fluttershy asked softly as she poured 2 generous measures of tea. As she turned to face the king, she nearly stumbled and dropped the tea at what she saw. A darkly handsome stallion was sitting at the table where Sombra had been. His coat was not quite as dark as the king's, and his horn was the more traditional spiral cone instead of the sharp hooked blade that the tyrant was known for. His eyes no longer flickered with emerald and lavender power, but instead were a warm shade of amber. His mane was still a rakish tumble-down, but combined with his slender frame, the whole of him was almost dangerously charming. Fluttershy felt her heartbeat deafening for a few moments as she tried to will the image of the Slaver King overtop this new intruder. There was many similarities, true. His expression was still a confident smirk, though much of the cruelty was lost along with the fangs. His eyes glimmered with hidden depths, but now she could easily imagine it with intelligence and humor, rather than with wickedness like before. His cutie mark was very strange, too. A horn and bisected circle, surrounded by a triangle on top of a plain cross. "Did I not tell you, Mouse?" The new stallion asked playfully, as he telekinetically retrieved his teacup. "I am Cole Amox, humble researcher and scholar of the Imperial College, come to Ponyville to witness the unusual flora and fauna and magical phenomenon of the Everfree Forest first hoof," smirking as he took a sip of the tea before humming appreciatively at the robust flavor. Fluttershy joined him nervously at the table with her own tea. Silently she took in his new form, which Sombra seemed not to mind. When he did speak again, he reached across the table and cupped a hoof beneath Fluttershy's chin. His touch was delicate, gentle even, if he was actually concerned that he might harm her. "And you, Mouse, are simply a kind-hearted Pegasus caretaker, who generously offered to open up her guest room to a weary traveler, so he might be nearer to his place of interest." Fluttershy shivered. She didn't know if that was out of disgust, fear, or something else. Surprisingly, she didn't find herself disliking the sensation of his touch. Sombra's hoof was feather light on her fur, barely even brushing her skin. Part of her was desperately wanting to tell him to stop, but the rest of her was frustratingly non-complacent. Sombra brushed her cheek, almost affectionately, with his hoof before pulling it away and returning to his tea. "Stop it," Fluttershy thought angrily to herself. "You are not allowed to be unhappy that he stopped. You're relieved that he took his evil hoof off of you, and you'll feel much better now that he isn't touching you anymore. Right?" "As you say, Your Majesty," were the only words that came out of her mouth. "Right?" "Tell me about yourself, Mouse," Sombra said, breaking the silence that had persisted since they had begun the long trot to the village center. "I would know more of my servant before I began interacting with the plebeian masses alongside." "That's not a very nice way to talk about them, Your Majesty," Fluttershy responded, a little sullen. "They're ponies, too. Good ponies. I've known many of them for years." Sombra smirked and gave a dry snort. "They are still the common masses, no matter how you paint them. They'll always be tarred by the brush of mediocrity until they are forced to rise above it, as you have. Now I have entertained your side topic. You will answer my question." Fluttershy winced, and Sombra felt a pang of annoyance. Her small, likely accidental disregard for his initial order had caused the guise to lash out, punishing her for the small disobedience. Well, that was her fault either way, had he not graciously explained the limits and boundaries of that enchantment. She would learn in time, though. In truth, the retributive pangs she had suffered since she had ensnared her mind were remarkably fewer than he had expected. Sombra chalked that up to her natural servile attitude. "As you say, Your Majesty," Fluttershy had answered after taking a steady breath. "I'm 24 years old and was born in Cloudsdale. I grew up serving one of the few remaining aristocratic Pegasi households. I attended primary and secondary school with excellent grades, although my grades in flight school were very poor as I had never been a strong flyer. After I came of age, I earned an apprenticeship under Ponyville's previous veterinarian, Misty Piper. I took on her post after she retired 5 years ago. Soon after that, I met my current group of friends, Pinky, Applejack, Twilight, and Rarity. Rainbow Dash I've known since I was a foal. Together we recovered the lost elements of Harmony and cleansed Nightmare Moon, turning her back into Princess Luna." Sombra stopped stock still as her last words. Fluttershy glanced back with confusion, painting her features. Your Majesty, are you okay? You said you recovered the elements of harmony. Sombra's voice was low and deadly. Fluttershy's eyes widened, slightly alarmed at his tone. After several seconds, she gave a small nod. I was given custody of the element of kindness, Fluttershy said, worry clear on her face. Sombra could hardly believe his ears. Although, we had to return them to the Tree of Harmony some months ago to keep it alive. Now we carry the power of the elements within us, at least a little bit. I don't really understand it, to be honest, really. I'm just a caretaker. Impossible! The thought continued to race through Sombra's mind as an alien sensation gripped his heart. Fear. The elements had torn his power away from his, banished him, and stolen his kingdom. They were arguably the most powerful magical artifacts in existence, as incredible as they were impossible to manipulate. They were supposed to be wielded by the godlike alicorns, but now? To hear this tiny, insignificant Pegasus living in the back end of nowhere tell it, the power was in other hooves. He wanted to accuse her of lying, a bitter irony, but he knew she wasn't. He could hear it in her voice. The little mouse was genuinely confused. Who holds the power of the other elements? Sombra hissed, eliciting another flinch from Fluttershy as his guise compelled the answer from her. My friends I mentioned, she answered, her face contorted in pain. Rainbow Dash is the element of loyalty, Applejack honesty, Rarity is generosity, Pinkie Pie is laughter, and Twilight is the last element, magic. Together we can use their power. And you said you were forced to return the physical force to the Tree of Harmony? Sombra asked, stalking closer to Fluttershy. She could feel his desire. He could feel her desire to run away from him, or even just to step back. The guise compelled her to remain in his presence, though. Yet you still claim them. Yes, Your Majesty, she answered, tears starting to form on her face as her legs were shaking. After we returned them, we discovered a chest with 6 locks on it by the tree. Over time, we found 5 of the keys. When a villain named Tyrek, who had escaped Tartarus over a year ago, took her magical away, did we find the last key and unlocked it. I don't remember very much of it, but I know there was a bright rainbow, a pure light that became part of us. We used it to undo Tyrek's magic, return his stolen powers to the ponies who took them from, and banished him back to his prison. No. Disbelief shuddered through Sombra's frame for a moment before he mastered himself. What she so casually speaks of? Even in my time they were mere legend and fantasy, a fable remnants of a myth, but how can she describe it so easily? I had to phase out the legends from 100 conflicting tomes. If this little mare is telling the truth, then what she carries within her is more valuable than all of Equestria and the Crystal Empire combined. I see. Sombra's eyes were fixed on the little mare in front of him. So you and your friends defeated Tyrek the Betrayer, one of the last great sorcerers, then? I will keep that in mind. Shall I expect your friends to be as unassuming as you are? Fluttershy nodded at first, but stopped and saying, well, yes and no. Most of us are just regular ponies, but Twilight is a princess. She ascended after solving one of Star Swirl the Bearded's unfinished spells. If you look over there, you can see her castle. Pointing her hoof east, Fluttershy gestured toward a glimmering spire. Sombra had wondered what it was, but had dismissed it as a trickery of his other questions. Landmarks had not been high on his list of queries. Now that he looked at it more closely, he made out the minarets and flags that flew above them. A fledgling princess. Twilight is the purple one, I assume. Sombra asked, not looking away from the castle in the distance. Yes, Your Majesty? Interesting. I have guessed at her nearest to alicornhood when she defeated my traps in the Empire. Sombra mused as he stepped back onto the road. But I had not thought she would ascend so quickly, nor that would she make her territory in such a backwater. I will have to take special care to avoid her direct arousing her suspicions. As you say, Your Majesty. Now, tell me more about your friends, Somber said as he began walking toward town. Somber's good humor had taken a back seat to his concern. Suddenly his choice of location for recovery seemed far more dangerous than he had initially guessed. Orders of magnitude more so. In fact, furthermore, if Fluttershy guessed at what he was truly doing, then, with this new information in Hoof, Somber suspected no amount of pain or threat would stop her from outing him. Normally, Fluttershy found the distance between her home and Ponyville to be almost reassuring. The introverted Pegasus liked being far away from the even limited bustle and excitement of civilization that the small village represented. When she did have to go into town on one of her errands, usually grocery shopping or a weekly spa visit with Rarity, she enjoyed the long, leisurely walk as a way to collect her thoughts, prepare herself for interacting with lots of ponies all at once, and enjoy the lovely countryside all around her. It was peaceful. Fluttershy couldn't help but feel nervous walking alongside Somber ever since their conversation. He seemed much more on edge than he had ever seen him. Even when he was collapsed in her backyard, he had seemed collected, controlled. Now it was almost like he was frightened, or at least concerned. On that one hoof, that was good, right? It meant there was something he was afraid of. If he was afraid of being beaten, it meant he could be beaten. On the other hoof, though, it also made him a lot scarier. Fluttershy knew first hoof how bad choices could be made out of fear. Sometimes it felt as though she had lived most of her life in a constant state of fear. Somber didn't seem like the type to act rashly, and as terrifying as he was, Fluttershy actually took some comfort in his cold and calculating nature. His fear seemed to sap some of that from him. The third hoof problem was that his concern had been put up a wall between them. She felt cut off from him, and if she couldn't reach him, how was she supposed to reform him? In the end, this is still my best choice to make it out of this, Fluttershy thought to herself as they approached. Maybe I just have to be a little brave this time, like I was last night. Mustering up all of her courage, Fluttershy sidled a little closer to Somber and leaned in, keeping her touch as light and soft as one of her feathers. Fluttershy gave him a gentle nuzzle to the side of his right foreleg. Somber flinched violently and stopped, whirling his head around to stare at her, bracing for an outburst. Fluttershy opened her mouth to speak first, keeping her voice calm and quiet and even, just like she did when she was with an injured animal. "Whatever is bothering you, Your Majesty, you can always tell me about it," Fluttershy said, not daring to look anywhere but his eyes. "Even if I wanted to, I couldn't tell any pony. Just because it wasn't my choice to take care of you doesn't mean I won't do my very best to help you get better. I just wanted you to know that, Your Majesty." For once, the mighty king seemed completely lost for words. He opened his mouth slightly, but nothing came out. Some of the tension had left his haunches, though, and, feeling daring, Fluttershy took a risk. Taking another step closer, she leaned in and rested her head on his shoulder in kind of a half-hug. She didn't dare try to put her forelegs around him. Fluttershy had a strong feeling that would be going a step too far. Baby steps, she thought to herself, and maybe one day we'll get there. It felt like an eternity passed before a little more of the tension left his body. And to Fluttershy's surprise, Somber lowered his head slightly to press it against her own. She risked a soft nuzzle against his cheek, and this time he didn't flinch or move away. "You're a fool, little mouse," Somber said, his voice very quiet. "You have no grasp of the depths I will sink to, no idea how deep my cruelty runs. You regret your kindness to me, I promise you that." Fluttershy pulled away slowly to meet his gaze. Though his frame was still that of Cole Amox, Somber's eyes were once again lined with dark magic. Strangely, she almost preferred him this way. It was unnerving, but it was him. It wasn't a disguise. Taking a deep breath, Fluttershy slowly shook her head side to side. "Respectfully, Your Majesty, I will never regret showing any pony kindness." She gave him a small smile, It was a little weak and a little shaky, but it was genuine. One of the few real, deliberate smiles she had shown him since he had arrived. Even you deserve kindness, and if anything, I'll make you regret dismissing it in the first place. Suddenly, realizing the rashness of what she had just said, Fluttershy stuttered out, If that's okay with you, I mean, Your Majesty. Rather than be angry, Sombra smirked. Be careful, Mouse. There is a difference between being forthright and being unfiltered. Shaking his head, Fluttershy was pleased to see his expression had returned to the more comfortable and confident grin. Too relieved that her gambit had succeeded, Fluttershy was taken by surprise as Sombra leaned down and pressed his forehead to hers, careful keeping his horn to the side. Shocked at his uncharacteristic and blatant display of affection, she almost missed his next words. There is no worse fool than a well-intended one, Sombra muttered. Well, if it pleases Your Majesty, I would rather be a well-intended fool than miss everything good in life. Fluttershy answered with a small chuckle, a little surprised by her own bravery. Don't think about how comfortable this feels. Fluttershy tried to work up some indignation, but to be fair, she had started it. Even if she hadn't expected him to return it. Oh, Pony Feathers is allowed to feel nice. We'll see, Sombra answered, enlacing a small giggle. Hey, Fluttershy! Whoa! A loud impact nearby told Fluttershy all she needed to know about who had just interrupted their little moment. Her head still cradled under Sombra's, Fluttershy turned to glance over the Cyan Pegasus that had just hit the ground to her right. She heard Sombra snorted with amusement, and Fluttershy could only chuckle a little too. Rainbow had a shell-shocked look on her face as she stared at the two of them. It was honestly really funny. Good morning, Rainbow, Fluttershy said, extracting herself from Sombra, who surprisingly seemed a little reluctant. How's the morning shift going? Okay, I guess, Rainbow answered before retrieving her jaw. Are you two like... Rainbow gestured back and forth between Sombra and Fluttershy, the latter whom blushed softly. Sorry, this is Cole Anox. Fluttershy looked to Sombra, who gave her a small approving nod. He's from the Crystal Empire and came here to study the plants and animals in the Everfree. I offer him room and board since I'm the only one who lives anywhere near it. Rainbow raised an eyebrow before glancing at Cole and looking him up and down with a critical eye. Starting at the tip of his horn, she looked him up and down. However, her methodical pace meant that her eyes drifted below his neck. She missed the faint spark of dark energy that lit momentarily from his horn. Fluttershy did not. She almost cried out as Rainbow's eyes lost focus and her expression glazed over. About a second later, she snapped back to reality and gave them both a crooked grin. Yeah, alright, he seems cool, Rainbow said, smirking. Not as cool as me, though, and like 0.75 rainbows on the awesome scale. I dig the black on black. Looking at Fluttershy, Rainbow winked. Nice clutch, Flutters. Rarity's gonna flip her horn when she sees this. Anyway, I'm on the clock, so laters! Rainbow Dash vanished in a prismatic blur, leaving a faintly blushing Fluttershy standing beside a smug-looking Sombra. What did you do to my friend? Fluttershy asked, a pang of discomfort in her head made her add, Your Majesty, to the end. Nothing dangerous, I assure you, Sombra answered with a small grin. I simply suggested that she see me in favorable light. Nothing more. No need to risk a bad first impression, after all. Fluttershy wasn't going to let go that easily. She eyed him suspiciously. You didn't guise her. Sombra laughed. No, my dear, maintaining a guise is not light work. Besides, it would be unnecessary. No, I simply took advantage of your friend's natural inclinations. Her brashness and attitude told me she was to try to go on her gut, discard any extra thought as superfluous. If I had waited until she made up her own mind, then I would have had to waste a great deal more time convincing her otherwise. Her type will take their first inclination and gallop with it. come high tide or Tartarus. So before she made up her mind, I gave her a nudge in the other direction. Start the ball rolling, so to speak. Her own nature gave it all the momentum it was needed after that. His explanation seemed sound. Not that Fluttershy had an expert on the field like mind magic. Still, I don't like the idea of you doing things to my friends' minds, Your Majesty. Sombra scowled, and as he did so, Fluttershy gasped at the flood of flame that suddenly filled her mind, setting off fireworks behind her eyes. As they faded, she found herself still standing, Sombra's magic keeping her in place. I have given you far more leeway than any servant I have ever owned, Mouse, Sombra growled. But do not, even for a moment, imagine that you are my equal. What you approve of is neither my concern nor my responsibility. I shall act as needed to ensure my recovery is as smooth as possible. Is that clear? Fluttershy's mouth was dry, her stomach clenched in pain, and her heart felt like she'd just finished going 2 rounds with the dragon, but she nodded silently. That wasn't what he had been looking for, however, as a spike of pain jabbed into her mind. I said, is that clear? This time, his voice was low and deadly. Crystal clear, Your Majesty.